They stand in the high desert of the American Southwest, carved into canyon walls and scattered across 1,000 square miles of sandstone. Perfect masonry, 5 stories tall, aligned with the stars, and standing empty for 800 years. The textbooks gave that emptiness a simple explanation. A peaceful farming people built the most sophisticated culture north of Mexico, and then, around the year 1200, they vanished. For a century and a half, that was the answer, a mystery with no ending. But in 2025, a study published in the journal Nature, requested by the Picuris Pueblo themselves, finally read the bones. What came back did not revise the textbook. It dismantled it. Because the Anasazi never disappeared. They were never lost, never gone, never a riddle at all. The mystery was manufactured. The question was never where these people went. It was who decided they had gone. To understand what was taken away, you first have to understand what was built. Chaco Canyon sits in the high desert of northwestern New Mexico, a shallow cut of sandstone about 9 miles long, surrounded by very little. No river of any consequence, no fertile valley, no obvious reason, looking at it today, why anyone would build anything here at all. The soil is thin, the rainfall is unreliable. The nearest timber stands more than 50 miles away, across open ground, in country with no draft animals and no wheels. And yet between roughly 900 and 1150, this canyon became the center of gravity for a civilization spanning about 90,000 square miles, an area larger than Ireland. They built great houses, more than 150 of them across the region, massive stone structures rising 4 and 5 stories. Pueblo Bonito, the largest, held roughly 650 rooms in a single sweeping D-shaped block. The walls were engineered rather than stacked, built with interior rubble cores faced in precisely cut sandstone veneer, a technique that produced load-bearing masonry capable of carrying multiple stories. Modern masons still study it. Modern masons still find it difficult. Some 200,000 roof timbers were cut in distant mountains and carried in on foot, and they connected it all. A network of roads ran out from the canyon across the desert, some of them 30 feet wide, holding straight lines for miles at a time. These were not trade routes in any ordinary sense. They climbed cliffs rather than routing around them. They ignored terrain entirely. They were built to say something about the culture that made them, not simply to move goods from one place to another. At the heart of every great house sat the kivas. Circular, sunken ceremonial chambers, some small enough for a family, some large enough to hold hundreds of people at once. These were the gathering places. These were the rooms where whatever held this world together was reinforced, generation after generation, for nearly 3 centuries. And they were watching the sky. In 1977, the artist Anna Sophia was recording petroglyphs on Fajada Butte when she noticed something above a spiral carved into the rock. 3 slabs of stone, leaning against the cliff face, channeled a blade of sunlight across that spiral at midday on the summer solstice. It was not decoration. It was an instrument. Planning, engineering, astronomy, coordinated labor on a scale that required thousands of people to agree, for generations, on what they were building and why. This was not a scattering of villages. This was something organized. And then, within a few generations, it stopped. The great houses emptied. The roads fell silent. The most ambitious construction project in prehistoric North America was left exactly as it stood. Doorways sealed, ceremonial chambers closed, 5-story walls holding against the wind with nobody inside them. Nothing was burned. Nothing was destroyed. They simply walked away and left it standing. An empty building is not an explanation. It is a question. And for most of the 20th century, the answer that settled into the textbooks was a remarkably comfortable one. A peaceful farming civilization, democratic, egalitarian, nearly utopian. A people who worshipped the sun and the corn and the turning of the seasons, who lived in harmony with the land and with one another, and who, for reasons nobody could quite specify, eventually dispersed into the wider desert and faded out of history. They were given a name borrowed from the Navajo language, Anasazi, a word that translates roughly as ancient enemies or the ancestors of our enemies, and which was never what these people called themselves. It was applied to them by outsiders, recorded by outsiders, and printed in books written by outsiders. Many archaeologists today use ancestral Pueblo instead, and the descendant communities have been asking for that change for a very long time. But for 100 years, Anasazi was the name attached to the mystery. And the mystery had a tidy shape. A civilization rose. A civilization vanished. Here are the ruins they left behind. That was the story in the museums. That was the story in the documentaries. That was the story taught to generations of school children and repeated, with confidence, in scholarly textbooks. Peaceful farmers, lost civilization, vanished people. The tidiness is the tell. Real histories do not resolve that cleanly. Real populations do not evaporate. And a story that ends with a shrug and the phrase, reasons unknown, is usually not a conclusion at all. It is a placeholder that somebody forgot to remove. And placeholders, left in place long enough, harden into facts. Here is the problem with all of it. Nearly every part of that narrative was constructed before anyone could read the bones. It was assembled before ancient DNA sequencing existed. Before forensic taphonomy, the study of what happens to a skeleton between death and excavation existed as a rigorous discipline. Before anyone had pulled genetic material from the skeletons buried beneath those great houses and compared it to the populations living across the Southwest today. What the 20th century had instead was pottery, architecture, the shape of a corn-grinding stone and the style of a ceremonial vessel. Researchers built elaborate models of an entire society out of fragments, and they were doing the honest best they could with the tools they had. But they had one more source available, and they largely declined to use it. The descendant communities had their own account of what happened at Chaco. It was not treated as evidence. It was filed as folklore, and folklore does not get a citation. So the bones sat in museum drawers in cities 1,000 miles away, cataloged, numbered, and unread for the better part of a century. When somebody finally read them, 3 things came apart at once. That Chaco had been equal, that Chaco had been peaceful, and that anyone had ever vanished at all. Start with the first one, start with a room. In 1896, the Hyde exploring expedition broke into a small chamber inside Pueblo Bonito, roughly 2 meters square. It has been known ever since as Room 33. Inside, they found the remains of 14 people. That alone was strange. Throughout the ancient Southwest, burial inside a building is unusual. Most Chacoans were interred outside the settlement in mounds of domestic debris with very little placed beside them. But the people in Room 33 had been buried in the heart of the largest great house in the canyon, and they had not gone quietly. Turquoise and shell beads in the thousands, a conch shell trumpet carried up from the Pacific coast, carved wooden flutes, ceremonial staffs. One man, laid on a plank floor, surrounded by more than 11,000 turquoise pieces. It remains the richest burial ever recovered in the United States Southwest. Archaeologists had understood for decades that these were venerated individuals. What they could not determine was why. Status can be inherited, or it can be earned. Grave goods do not tell you which. For that, you need the bones themselves. In 2017, a team published a study in the journal Nature Communications. It was led by Douglas Kennett of Penn State, with Stephen Plogg of the University of Virginia, Adam Watson of the American Museum of Natural History, and George Perry of Penn State. They combined high-precision radiocarbon dating with ancient DNA extracted from the Room 33 remains. 9 individuals yielded readable genetic material. All 9 carried identical mitochondrial genomes. Mitochondrial DNA passes only from a mother to her children. Identical mitogenomes across 9 people mean one thing. These were not 9 high-status individuals from across Chacoan society. They were one family, traced through the female line. The team suspected contamination immediately. They checked. They found none. David Reich's laboratory at Harvard Medical School ran the analysis independently and confirmed the result. Then the nuclear genomes from the 6 best-preserved samples went further, identifying specific relationships within the group. A mother and her daughter, a grandmother and her grandson. And the radiocarbon dates placed these burials across roughly 330 years, from about 800 to 1130, which is almost exactly the entire lifespan of Chaco Canyon as a center of power. Kennett was careful about what this did and did not show. Not a state, he said, not a kingdom, but not egalitarian either. Robert Hard of the University of Texas at San Antonio raised the obvious limit, and it is worth keeping. 9 people from one crypt may represent a single elite family rather than the structure of an entire civilization. Other burial clusters have not been sequenced. Still, the direction was unmistakable. The textbooks had described a people without rulers. The DNA described a lineage that held the center of that world for 3 centuries. One more thing about that study which matters later. The descendant communities were not consulted before it was done. That was the first pillar. The second took 40 years to bring down, and the fight over it has still not entirely ended. Christy Turner was a physical anthropologist at Arizona State University. Working with his wife Jacqueline, he spent 4 decades examining skeletal collections from across the Southwest, and he kept finding the same thing. Bones that had not been buried. Bones that had been taken apart. He built a checklist to test it, and he made it deliberately hard to satisfy. 6 criteria. Fracture patterns consistent with breaking fresh bone rather than weathered bone. Cut marks from stone tools at the joint ends where tendon meets bone. Anvil abrasion, the scraping left when a bone is smashed between 2 stones. Burning. Pot polish, a fine sheen produced by bone stirred inside a ceramic vessel. And missing vertebrae. Mancorn, published in 1999, cataloged 76 cases. The Turners confirmed 54, discounted 8, and declined to rule on 14. Across 38 sites, the remains of 286 people met the criteria. And for 20 years, the field had a serious answer for all of it. Butchering is not eating. That objection was not evasion, it was good science. A body can be dismembered in witch execution, in secondary burial, in the punishment of enemies. Processing marks record what was done to a corpse. They cannot record what happened next. The gap closed in Colorado. Cowboy Wash sits in southwestern Colorado and dates to around 1150. An excavation led by Brian Billman recovered 7 individuals from 2 pit houses. In the 3rd pit house, in a cold hearth, sat a human coprolite. Desiccated waste preserved by the desert air. Richard Marlar at the University of Colorado Health Sciences Center designed a test for human myoglobin. Myoglobin sits in skeletal and heart muscle. It does not occur in the human gut. It was present in the coprolite. It was present in residue from a cooking pot at the same site. It was absent from 20 control coprolites from comparable settlements and absent from vessels at earlier sites. The findings ran in Nature in the year 2000. Now the other side, because it is substantial. Kurt Dongoski and colleagues published a formal critique in American Antiquity that same year, arguing alternative explanations had not been properly excluded. The Cowboy Wash team answered in print. Hopi and Zuni communities have contested the interpretation for decades, and their central point stands on its own. Accusations of cannibalism have been used throughout American history to dehumanize Native peoples. Forensic evidence records what was done to a body. It cannot recover what that act meant to the people performing it, and the limits matter. Even the researchers agree this was not routine. These are concentrated events, not a diet. Turner's own explanation that a Mexican-derived cult imposed this as social control remains his hypothesis. No genetic evidence supports it. The bones showed that Chaco was not peaceful. They did not show why. So Chaco was hierarchical. So Chaco was violent. Neither of those things empties a canyon on its own. For that, you need the ledger the desert keeps, and it keeps a good one. Trees in arid country lay down a wide ring in a wet year and a narrow one in a dry year. Overlap enough timbers and you can reconstruct rainfall across the Southwest, season by season, going back more than 1,000 years. Chaco is full of timber, 200,000 beams, many datable to the year. The canyon recorded its own collapse. Great house construction ceases around 1130. And at almost exactly that point, the San Juan Basin enters a drought that runs for roughly 50 years to about 1180. It ranks among the most severe of the last millennium. Chaco had always been exposed to this. The canyon had no reliable water of its own. Its farmland was marginal in a good year. The great houses and the roads and the ceremonial calendar had been sustained by a coordinated effort to move maize and timber inward from outlying communities across 90,000 square miles. The center did not feed itself. It was fed. When the outlying regions stopped producing a surplus, that arrangement had nothing left to move. The tribute stopped. The coordination broke. Whatever authority had persuaded thousands of people to haul roof beams 50 miles on foot for a century and a half stopped being persuasive. And here the archaeology becomes strange in a specific way. Nothing was sacked. Nothing was burned in anger. Doorways were sealed with masonry. Great kivas were deliberately closed. Ritual vessels were gathered, stacked, and put beyond use. This was not flight. This was closure. The departure took generations. Population shifted north toward Mesa Verde, where communities built the cliff dwellings for another century. Then in 1276, a second drought arrived and ran to 1299, cutting rainfall across the entire region. Stephen Lexon of the University of Colorado estimates that by 1300, the 5,000 to 10,000 people still living in the Four Corners had pulled up stakes. By 1300, the Four Corners was empty of farming populations. The kivas that had held hundreds fell silent. The roads went back to desert. The great houses were left to the wind and the sun. And this is the exact moment the textbook stops. The vanishing, the lost civilization, the empty rooms, and the unanswered question. Every version of the story freezes here and calls it a mystery, which is convenient, because this is also the precise point at which the story stopped looking. The people who walked out of that canyon did not stop existing when they crossed the ridgeline. They went somewhere. They took their maize and their masonry and their calendars with them, and they went somewhere specific. Somebody could have thought to ask where they had gone. For nearly 700 years, almost nobody with a university post ever did. Almost nobody. Because the people who already knew the answer had been saying it out loud the entire time. The Hopi, the Zuni, the Acoma, and the Rio Grande Pueblos have never had a mystery here. Chaco is ancestral. Migration is not a gap in their history. It is the structure of it. Their traditions describe movement, not disappearance, and they describe it in detail. That account was available for the whole century in which the textbook version was written. It was simply filed as story rather than evidence. Meanwhile, the archaeology kept circling the answer without landing on it. Mitochondrial data from domestic turkeys and dogs pointed to a large movement of people out of the Four Corners and into the northern Rio Grande in the 13th century. Pottery styles matched. Masonry matched. Everything pointed the same direction. What was missing was human DNA. And the human DNA belonged to somebody. In 2019, archaeologists from Southern Methodist University informed the Picuris Pueblo of ancestral remains near Taos that had been excluded from earlier repatriation. The Picuris were at that moment fighting drilling near Chaco and finding their objections dismissed for lack of documented connection. So they did something no federally recognized tribe had done before. They commissioned the study themselves. Picuris leadership approached Eske Willerslev at the University of Copenhagen, working with Michael Adler and David Meltzer of Southern Methodist University. Consultation ran for 2 years. The tribe held the right to halt the project at any point for any reason. Richard Mermejo, a former governor of Picuris, was central to the work and is a named author. He died in 2024 before it was published. The results appeared in Nature in 2025, with Tomás Pinotti as first author. The team sequenced 16 ancient genomes from individuals buried at Picuris between roughly 1300 and 1500 and compared them against saliva samples from 13 living members of the tribe. Then they compared both against the Pueblo Bonito genomes from room 33. The continuity was unbroken. Ancient Picuris and living Picuris are closely related, and both are closely linked to the people buried in Chaco Canyon, including descent through a Chacoan maternal line. The same maternal line that ran through that crypt for 330 years did not end when the canyon emptied. It walked out and kept going. And the demography settles it. The ancestral Picuris population held stable at roughly 3,000 people after the great houses were abandoned. That is not a collapse. That is a community that relocated, kept its numbers, and carried its descent forward into the present day. Pinotti was careful about the scope. The study does not redefine what any other tribal nation has said about Chaco. It adds one line of evidence supporting the Picuris claim that their ancestors were part of that world. One line of evidence requested by the descendants, answering a question their grandparents had answered already. So the mystery had an author. It was not found in the canyon. It was assembled in universities and museums a long way from New Mexico by people who looked at empty buildings and decided the story required an ending. Then they wrote one and taught it for 100 years. The buildings were empty. The lineage was not. Those were never the same fact, and treating them as one is the whole of the error. Ancient DNA did not rediscover the Anasazi. It has no such power. What it did was arrive 8 centuries late at a conclusion the descendant communities had been stating plainly the entire time, and grant it the one thing it had always been denied: a citation. The real question was never what happened to the people who built Chaco Canyon. It is how long it took everyone else to notice they never left.